From New York City, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and this is the One Way Ticket Show. Hello and welcome once again to another episode of the show where we explore with our guests where they'd go if given a one-way ticket, no coming back. Their destinations may be in the past, present, future, real, imaginary, even a state of mind, but once again, the only caveat, there's no coming back. Now, you can listen to all episodes on our website, theonewayticketshow.com. Once again, theonewayticketshow.com. Or you can search for The One Way Ticket Show wherever you like to download your podcast. And while you're at it, do rate and review us because that really helps with our rankings, which make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. And one more point of housekeeping, if you haven't done so already, do follow the show and me on all social media. Just search for The One Way Ticket Show and Stephen Shalowitz. And you got to put the before One Way Ticket Show. The One Way Ticket Show and Stephen Shalowitz, and would love to hear from each of you. All right, as for this episode, we warmly welcome back Joshua Hammer into the studio. Of course, Joshua's our guest on episode 112 back in September 2016, which was an absolute lifetime ago. Of course, he's a journalist and author, and his career has included serving as Newsweek bureau chief in Nairobi, Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, Berlin, Jerusalem, and Cape Town. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, National Geographic, and the Smithsonian, just to name a few. He's a New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, which we talked about in our last conversation. He also wrote The Falcon Thief, and his latest book, drumroll please, hot off the presses and released just 2 days ago as we record this episode. It's called The Mesopotamian Riddle, an archaeologist, a soldier, a clergyman in the race to decipher the world's oldest writing. It's published by Simon & Schuster, and I hope you pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. It's a fabulous read. And Josh, congratulations on the book.
Thanks,
Thanks
Stephen.
So much for joining us here once
Happy
again
to
on
be
the
back.
One Way Ticket
Delighted
Show.
to be back.
Oh, well, it's great to have you aboard. And as I wrote to you, I'm a huge history nut. So for me, it was such a joy to read this book, and having traveled through the Near East, it brought back a lot of wonderful memories for me indeed. So I look forward to chatting about the book and the characters in the book and the whole meaning behind ancient civilizations and so forth. But before we get to all of that, of course, this is the One Way Ticket Show. So I just want to ask you if your one-way ticket that you shared with me last time, way back in September of 2016, if your one-way ticket to Manhattan circa 1967 still holds.
Well, I have to say I was enticed by the idea of Assyria in 600 BC after working on this book. But generally, I think that Manhattan in 1967 would have been a far more pleasant place to live.
I tend to agree with that. Absolutely. All right. Well, listen, Manhattan circa 1967, it still is. When you write your next book or even before, we'll have you back and we'll revisit it and see if it still holds. Okay. All right. But listen, I want to dive into the book. Once again, the Mesopotamian Riddle. And really, before we talk about the characters, I want you to share really the backstory behind the book, set the stage in broad brushstrokes, what the book is all about.
Okay, so I like to say that the book is really about 2 quests going on almost simultaneously. One was the archaeological quest on the ground to search for a lost civilization. In this case, the lost civilization empire, the lost Assyrian Empire, which had pretty much vanished off the face of the map in 600 or so BCE. And there were rumors that about it being somewhere, but no traces of it had been found. And so part of the story is this remarkable quest and discovery. The second quest is the intellectual detective story to understand the writing that was discovered once they made these finds. Well, I mean, the writing had been out there, but not in in tantalizing bits and pieces. But it wasn't until the rediscovery of the lost civilization that the world got a full look at the writing, the completely impenetrable, ununderstandable, dead language and writing of the Assyrian and Babylonian Empire. And then that touched off an intense quest the second quest of the book, to try to understand the writing.
And that's cuneiform.
Cuneiform, exactly.
Right, cuneiform.
A form of cuneiform, yes.
Right. And then talk about the public's interest in the ancient world in the early 1800s when the book begins.
Early and mid-1800s, the world archaeology was a pretty new invention innovation really beginning in the 18th century with the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And then that continued into the early 19th century with the discovery of the Valley of the Kings in Egypt and secret doors in one of the pyramids of Giza that led to the heart of the pharaoh's death chamber. Just remarkable discoveries that got the public whipped up in the rediscovery of these lost worlds, one of which in the 1840s was the Empire of Assyria. So there was a great fascination with looking back at the ancient past and trying to understand it and learn about it and glean lessons for even for the roots of the current civilization that people were living in at the time. Yeah.
And you painted such a wonderful portrait of the archaeologists and the scholars of the time who unearthed and were trying to decipher these languages. And I'd love to really tick them off right now for our listeners and for our viewers. The first was actually Edward Norris from the Royal Asiatic Society.
Well, Edward Norris, I really view Edward Norris as a sort of peripheral figure. I mean, he was the guy, yes, he was a linguist.
But it starts with him.
Well, it starts with him as the sort of supervisor of this challenge, the great cuneiform challenge to determine if, in fact, the language was the language writing. But it has to separate these two. You know, there is a writing system and a language, and this particular writing system was applied to several different languages. So Assyrio-Babylonian, the great language and writing of the great empire, was under people were working on trying to decipher it. There was a lot of skepticism about whether it was in fact understandable, whether it was even a real writing or just a design on crazy designs on palace walls. And so Norris devised a competition in 1857, a challenge really in which 4 linguists who had devoted their lives to studying this would all independently decipher a cylinder, an engraved or inscribed cylinder from about 1100 BC. Work on it separately with no contact with each other, with one another, and would send their versions in separately to meet a deadline, and then judges would look at them and compare them and decide if in fact the decipherments were close enough that would indicate that, in fact, cuneiform was a real language, a real writing, and could be deciphered.
Right. And one of the participants of that is one of the gentlemen who is a thread throughout the book that I want you to highlight, and that's Henry Creswick Rawlinson.
Rawlinson got the ball rolling, really. So he was a fairly affluent, he was the son of an affluent landowner near Oxford, in Oxfordshire, who shipped out with the British East India Company originally to Bombay. Within a couple of years, he was sent off to Persia because the British were helping to train the Shah's troops back then. This was a bit in the 1820s, actually, late 1820s, early 1830s. He became absolutely entranced, mesmerized by ancient Persian society, the ancient Persian Empire, which ruled a lot of the world back around 500 BC. And he became he was a linguist, self-taught linguist. He became obsessed with trying to decipher the writing and language of the old Persian Empire of Darius the Great and Cyrus the Great and Xerxes. So these emperors had left their cuneiform-based writing all over Persia, on walls, on cliffs, on tombs. And so Rawlinson just basically, whenever he had some spare time, just traveled around and got himself in some incredible positions, climbing up 300-foot cliffs and balanced on a ladder to transcribe these cuneiform writings, and then back in his office or at home, wherever, worked assiduously on translating first the language of the old Persian Empire.
And then he eventually worked for the British East India Company.
He was at the British East India Company. He went to war, and he was doing this. He was one of these interesting characters. You see them, periodically pop up. Scholar soldiers. Think of T.E. Lawrence, 80, 90 years later. Well, Rawlinson was in that tradition. So when he wasn't transcribing inscriptions on palace walls or on cliffs, he was off to Afghanistan to fight against Pashtun warriors in the British attempt to conquer and hold Afghanistan. When that war was done, he was then appointed ambassador to Baghdad. British East India Company and the Foreign Office of Britain were pretty much one and the same in those days. So that's what he did. And it was while he was based in Baghdad in this kind of ramshackle palace on the Tigris River that he then turned his attention to the cuneiform writing of the Assyro-Babylonian Empire. And that was considered, Old Persian was cool. He had done that and achieved a lot of great success and some accolades in Britain. But the holy grail really was to understand the writing and language of what was viewed as this lost, the greatest, most powerful, some would say evil empire on earth that had vanished without a trace in about 600 BC.
Well, there were other characters, again, that wove a thread through the book. The other one is Austin Henry Layard.
Yeah, Austin Henry Layard and Rawlinson worked very closely together. So Austin Henry Layard was a son of a bureaucrat in the British Empire whose father died pretty young of asthma. And Layard was obliged, without having really any family money, to go work for his uncle as a lawyer in training in the city of London. He was really bored by it, lasted a couple of years, and then basically shipped off on what would now be viewed as sort of the hippie trail to Asia, except this was the Ottoman Empire in 1830. And there were no guidebooks. There were no let's go Mosul,
no Lonely Planets.
No Lonely Planet Iraq. So he was off with another traveler. The two of them went overland through the really chaotic and dangerous Ottoman Empire. Eventually, he made it to Mosul in northern Iraq, what is now northern Iraq, and stared out at these mounds that had never been touched in 2,500 years, but were rumored to have to conceal the lost civilization of Assyria. So he began digging, began turning up incredible ruins and perfectly preserved bas-reliefs and sculptures, and began working closely with Rawlinson, who was then down in Baghdad as the ambassador, discussing the language and the writing and the civilization, shipping him relics from the mounds, which were then passed on to Basra, and then from there on to the British Museum in London.
One thing that really struck me was he was really young. And he was
23 years old when he made these.
Yeah, and then he had such a robust career while he was there, and he left when he was 34.
34, yeah. Finished as an archaeologist after achieving.
And then he became a member of Parliament.
Yeah, became a member of Parliament, and then ended up a diplomat, returning to Constantinople, I believe, and then eventually back to spend his last years in Venice.
Yeah, he was one of the real seminal characters in archaeology in the region.
He was like the first sort of universally recognized great archaeologist. I mean, then Schliemann, the German who discovered Troy, came along like 15, 20 years later, I think. I have to double check my dates on Troy. But Layard was the first sort of universally known and recognized archaeologist of the ancient world.
Another character, Edward Hinks.
Edward Hinks was maybe the most brilliant decipherer who ever lived. Most brilliant he was obsessed with ancient languages. He had worked on hieroglyphs. He had worked on Hebrew when Hebrew was a dead language in the 19th century. There was no Palestine, no Israel. They had not revived Hebrew, so it was dead. But he worked on these languages, became intimately acquainted with the variety and methodology and etymology of these ancient tongues, and then turned to Assyro-Babylonian about the same time that Old Persian and then Assyro-Babylonian, sort of on a parallel track with Rawlinson. The difference was that while Rawlinson was off fighting in wars and living this really exotic, adventurous life in the Middle East, Hinks was holed up as a pastor in a remote, isolated corner of Northern Ireland, and really just sort of depended on getting colleagues and friends to send him lithographs of these inscriptions, and worked on them in the Rectory while Rawlinson was off having these amazing adventures. They were turned into intense and often vicious competitors.
Right, we're going to talk about that in a sec. But one thing that really surprised me was that he never made it out there.
Never made it out there. No, the closest.
Yet he was an expert on the region.
Yeah, the closest he came was this exhibit in Hyde Park, I think, or Leicester Square. It was in Leicester Square. It was a giant globe where tourists could enter and climb ramps and staircases and see recreated in miniature landscapes and human edifices, including the palaces of Nineveh. So that this tourist Disneyland, mid 19th century Disneyland version of Assyria was as close as Hinks ever came.
Right. Another character that I want to talk about before we talk about the interplay among several of them, William Henry Fox Talbot. And I must say, I never heard his name before. And he is really an important figure for those of us that like to take photos.
Yeah, exactly. I hadn't heard of Talbot either.
Okay, I don't feel so badly, Josh.
Before I started research on this book, I always thought that Louis Daguerre was the founder of photography. So I did a little research. I actually went out to Talbot's estate in west of London, and he pretty much was on the same track as Daguerre in founding work. He was on his own track and to create photography, and they pretty much arrived at the same. Via different routes, they arrived at the same creation in 1840. So Talbot became known as the co-father of photography, but he was also an incredible polymath. He was just this enthusiast who was into everything from observing comet tails to learning, spoke about 17 languages, was a math genius. He was a world-class gardener, and eventually in the mid-1850s he became entranced with Assyro-Babylonian language and writing, and this became his new passion, and he pursued that to the end, for the rest of his life. But he was also the guy who helped with Norris to get this whole 1857 competition going, because he was tired of being kind of mocked and ridiculed, and there's nothing to this writing. It's bogus. These explanations, these decipherments are bogus. So he created this competition to prove that the writing and language could be deciphered.
And before we get to the competition, and there are several other characters in the book, but just in the interest of time, I just want to tick one other off. I might tick another off in just a sec, but Jules Oppert. I thought he was an interesting character.
Yeah, Oppert's a little hard to find that much there's not a huge amount of information about him, but what is out there is quite interesting. I mean, he was a descendant of a very influential Jewish banker who was the personal banker, I believe,
of Leopold I,
to the of Leopold I, exactly, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
I believe
correct?
So.
Yes, and I guess he inherited a certain amount of wealth, but when he wanted to and became a scholar of the first rank of languages and of classical languages, and eventually of Assyrio-Babylonian, and basically he was stymied from pursuing a university career in Germany. He was from Hamburg, but he was anti-Semitism made it impossible for him to become a tenured professor. He left Germany, hooked up with an expedition to Babylon run by a French archaeologist, early days of archaeology, again, 1840s. Went down there, had incredible adventures, just made some amazing discoveries in the ruins of Babylon, came back something of a celebrity, and was one of the four who was brought in. Well, was also a very dynamic, extroverted. Everybody describes him as this amazingly charming figure who spoke a lot of languages, who had the French royal family adored him. He was, embraced by scholars all around Europe. He was apparently quite a dynamic and irresistible character. And he was brought into this challenge that we keep dancing around.
Exactly. And so
as one of the four. Yes.
Yes. So let's go to that challenge. 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society to translate 800 lines of Akkadian text.
Yeah. In 1853, I believe, an archaeologist, an Iraqi archaeologist, or a Mesopotamian archaeologist who worked closely with Layard, had dug up 10 feet underground this sort of bowling pin-sized clay cylinder, deep underground at the foot of a temple, inscribed with tiny, almost microscopic. I mean, you could not read it with a naked eye. You needed a powerful magnifying glass. Some scribe had managed to basically tell the entire annals of one of the great early kings of Assyria in a bowling pin-sized 8-sided octagon. That was, again, tremendously hard to read, but it was a fairly recent discovery in 1857 when Talbot had the idea to distribute this among several scholars and have them all work on it on alone, with no collaboration, communication with any of the others, and then to turn in their results to a panel of judges who would determine if, in fact, cuneiform was decipherable. So that included Opere, that included Rawlinson, that included Hinks, and Talbot himself.
And the answer is?
Am I supposed to give that away? I think it's pretty evident what the answer is.
The title of the book is The Mesopotamian Riddle, so maybe we should just keep it as a riddle.
Let's leave it as a riddle. They'll probably, your listeners and viewers,
they can probably
guess
figure it out
how it turns out.
Right.
But there's a lot of adventures and excitement leading up to that point.
There really, really are.
So.
Can you talk about the method to the madness of how they really deciphered it? Because for me, that was so interesting.
I wish I knew. I have some idea, but I'll never grasp it entirely. But
if you can check, not only
ideas.
the written, but also the verbal as well. Because the verbal, I'm actually really interested in.
Okay, well, let me start with a completely different object, the Rosetta Stone.
Yes.
Because understanding how the Rosetta Stone was deciphered will help explain Syro-Babylonian. So Rosetta Stone, for people who may or may not remember, it was a slab found in a fort near Alexandria in Egypt, dated to about 100 BC or maybe even earlier, that had it was a proclamation by a bunch of priests to the Greek Egyptian pharaoh, because at that time Egypt was under Greek rule, and it had ancient Greek, hieroglyphs, and demotic, which is a shorthand version of hieroglyphs. The key thing here is that it had ancient Greek, which scholars, I wouldn't say everybody, but educated people understood ancient Greek. That was a dead language, but the writing was still understandable. So what the earliest decipherers did was look for parallels between the ancient Greek and the hieroglyphs. For instance, the name of an Egyptian king written in Greek appeared with equal frequency in both the Greek and the hieroglyph inscription, and they kind of knew how it was pronounced, so they could match it up, get the vowel sound, get the sounds of those symbols, and from there, once they had a few sounds worked out, it kind of gradually opened up our hieroglyphs. So in the same way, but even more difficult, actually. So the decipherers made the first inroads in cuneiform. What Rawlinson and others noticed, was that all over Persia there were inscriptions in cuneiform, but written in 3 different languages side by side. They quickly surmised that they were basically saying the same thing in 3 different cuneiform scripts and languages of the empire. So the idea would be that if they could tackle one of these and figure it out, then it would be an entry into understanding the others. So they started with the Old Persian. Rawlinson started with the Old Persian, which was phonetic, had only about 35 characters. There's a long story about how he actually cracked it. He didn't have ancient Greek, He had to basically figure out through intuition, through guesswork, he figured out over the course of 10 years how the Old Persian worked. And once he got that figured out, he could then use that to work on a Syro-Babylonian. He could make the parallels, look for the names of kings. Well, here's the king here in the Old Persian. Let me look down here and match it up with these Assyrian characters that I don't understand, but maybe it says the exact same thing here. So maybe this character matches up with that Old Persian character, and gradually, bit by bit, through trial and error, the entire language and writing was revealed. Yeah.
And then in terms of the sound, they relied on other languages, didn't they?
Yeah, wow. Well, the Old Persian, Rawlinson knew these Persian kings as Darius, Cyrus, and Xerxes. So these were Greek, but these were Greek names. These they were just sort of transliterations that bore very little relation to the actual names of the Persian kings. So Rawlinson had to figure out, well, what did these Persian kings? What were the real sounds of these? What did the Persian kings call? What did the Persians call their Persian kings? So that required massive research into looking for a language that resembled Old Persian from 2,700 years ago, but was still in existence today. And he found his way to this. It's really a long story. He found his way to the Zoroastrians, who maintained in their prayer books, writing and language that resembled the old Persian, which was dead and gone. But he was able, through these Zoroastrian prayer books, if you can believe it, to suss out how the old Persian would have sounded.
And I believe also Sanskrit was used.
Sanskrit. But first came the Zoroastrian, and then they began to realize, hey, Sanskrit too. It kind of was early in the days of philology, the study of languages, when they were just beginning to make these connections between languages and there were lots of theories about how languages spread around the world.
Because you talk about they were wondering, is it a Semitic language, for example?
Well, that was another critical thing. Yeah, was this Old Persian was not. Old Persian was classified as an Indo-European language in these, which turned out to be correct. So, but Layard and others suspected that this Assyro-Babylonian must have been Semitic. Because of just mostly through geography. Hey, it's in the middle of this area where you have Palestine, where Aramaic is being spoken, Arabic. It was purely, a supposition.
Yeah.
A couple of people like Hinks, he was one of the first to surmise that it was Semitic. And what Hinks did was began slowly getting the phonetic meanings of these, the sounds of these characters, and then began looking for possible Semitic sounding names, like words or names that sounded like the Hebrew. And once he actually found a couple, and on the basis of a couple of these, he said, "Oh yeah, this is a Semitic language because I see the word for I am." In Assyrian, it comes out like as Anoku, and that bore some relation to the Hebrew. And so he made this declaration, this is Semitic. Just a wild guess. He didn't really have solid proof, but he followed his intuition. He followed his nose. And on the basis of declaring this a Semitic language, it kind of really helped because sentence structures, words, everything began to open up once they could make that definition. Oh, this is Semitic.
Yeah, and they could rely on Hebrew. I know you said it was a dead language, but
yeah, Hebrew was also dead.
Well, the only thing is, though, it was used in prayer, so people knew the sound. So
it was
used in prayer.
Absolutely.
And then also Jewish communities did use that as a lingua franca, let's say.
You're right. It was never fully dead. It was dead as a spoken language, outside. But it was like Coptic. That's one of the ways they revived. They discovered the meaning of hieroglyphs because Champollion discovered that Coptic is still the language of prayer in the Egyptian Coptic Church.
Yeah.
And it was closely related to hieroglyphs. So they made the same thing.
Yeah, Hebrew, though, although, and I don't want to get sidetracked, but it was actually used to a degree amongst communities.
Yeah, okay.
It was. So they could draw on that. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating as a Hebrew speaker to see the words that are from Hebrew that are very similar to those that were listed in the book.
Actually thousands of words that were really
So it could very well have been a Semitic language. Really.
Yeah, absolutely. So once Hinks made that determination, and then Rawlinson followed suit, but it was like it really helped to break open. Of course, they still had to figure out what apply phonetic values to these bizarre ancient characters that had been lost. Yeah.
One point, though, can you talk about the relationship amongst these characters, if you will, before we move on to really the difficulty that they face, difficulties, I should say, that they face. But
on
there
all
was
fronts.
On all fronts. But there was such an interesting interplay amongst these
I didn't know that going into. Of course, I knew nothing about these characters. I knew a little bit about Layard from other readings. But I didn't realize the complex interplay between them, which I agreed was one of the most fascinating aspects of the research. So Layard,
there were a lot of egos involved.
Layard and Rawlinson were out there in the wilds of the Ottoman Empire, in one of the nastiest, most difficult places in terms of weather and sheer danger from these marauding bands of Bedouins who did not like any foreign presence there. And had their own codes that allowed them to attack, individuals treading on their territory.
Yes.
Highly dangerous. Anyway, it bonded them. Layard was up there in Mosul, 250 miles away was Rawlinson in Baghdad. They were trading ideas back and forth, mostly by letter. They visited each other a couple of times. Layard was shipping down these amazing artifacts, relics. So it created an incredibly intense bond for a few years between them. However, over time, Rawlinson was a prickly character. He was not an easy guy to deal with. He was a bit of a, I don't know, well, he was a bit arrogant. He could be almost childish in his anger and jealousy and rage. And I think Layard did not really take to that. And then more importantly, he began to doubt some of Rawlinson. Yeah, Rawlinson had translated Old Persian, deciphered Old Persian, but he seemed to be on a lot shakier ground when it came to Assyro-Babylonian. So meanwhile, you have this Hinks, Reverend Hinks off there in Ulster working on it and getting in touch with Layard, reaching out to Layard. And Layard begins to look at Hinks's work and begins to think this guy appears to be, because Layard had he was an amateur decipherer. He didn't approach it with the assiduity of Rawlinson and Hinks, but he had an understanding. So he appreciated Hinks, and bit by bit, he began to move away from Rawlinson and toward Hinks, to the point of actually, when he was up and returned to London, visiting Hinks and spending 2 weeks side by side with him in his rectory, working on these on the decipherment together. Rawlinson got wind of this. He was always, as I said, a very prickly character. And when he began to perceive Layard and Hinks moving together into this bond and Layard kind of cold shouldering Rawlinson, it drove him absolutely nuts. So there was a lot of dynamic of there. And then Rawlinson, of course, turned his rage not only against Layard but against Hinks, and there became this fierce enmity. And Hinks was despite his his isolation and his reclusiveness and his profession as a pastor, he was no shrinking violet. He did not take kindly to being dissed, to having, for instance, Rawlinson claim credit for discoveries that Hinks believed he had made far before Rawlinson. So it became a very intense, as I just say in the book, pas de trois. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I can coin that phrase myself, but you all know what a pas de deux is. But this was 3 guys involved in this very intense rivalry and shifting of allegiances and alliances that actually culminated quite badly.
I want to talk about how difficult the work actually was.
Yeah.
And in the book, there was a quote by Jean-Baptiste Eugène Flandin, the French painter and archaeologist in 1840, who wrote, quote, "The study of antiquity is assuredly a noble pursuit, but what do we have to put ourselves through in the process?"
Yeah. And my own French translation, it was somewhat idiomatic. I think I got it right, though.
It reminded me, years ago, I met a French archaeologist. He was actually the guide on a tour that I was on in Sudan.
Uh-huh.
And he shared with me in Italian, he was Italian rather, he shared with me in Italian, quote, "La vida è dura per l'uomo di cultura." Life is tough
good.
for the cultured
Yes,
man.
yes.
And that kind of reminded me of this because, what they had to go through, and I want you to weigh on this, the transportation. This was not
There was no transportation.
Yeah, this was not glamping.
No.
Okay.
No.
People got really, really sick and died.
Yeah, many.
Okay.
Many of the people in the book died.
Right.
Yes.
So let's talk first a little bit about that, how difficult the conditions were that they were living in.
Baghdad, which is like the height of civilization in that part of the world, right? The only real city of note. You had like cholera epidemics and malaria epidemics sweeping through Baghdad, in which 1/5 of the population would die. It happened repeatedly. Rawlinson would have to take his staff and retreat to the wilderness and wait out these cholera epidemics in the middle of nowhere. So that was one thing. Then you had this constant low-level war going on between the Bedouins and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman, they didn't want to be taxed. They didn't want to be, this was their land. They didn't appreciate the Ottomans trying to throw their weight around and turn them into a sedentary people.
Right.
And so they resisted. They resisted furiously. There was constant warfare. And
there was banditry, and there were
guerrillas.
guerrillas.
There was huge banditry. The banditry was basically waged against, if you got on the road in this part of the world, and you were especially if you were a solitary traveler, forget it. You had a better than even chance of being attacked. They didn't tend to kill you. That wasn't part of the code. They were actually, there's been some very interesting writing from that time of amateur anthropologists who spent a lot of time with these people and kind of got a sense of their code of honor. So they wouldn't kill you, but they would basically take everything you had, and they would strip you down to your underwear, including your shoes. There were scenes of British army officers, archaeologists begging, "It's just leave me my shoes at least. I gotta walk through the no, shoes went." So this happened on numerous occasions, several documented in the book. So they were very wary of the dangers of travel anywhere in this part of the world.
And at one point, and I think it was Rawlinson, who's quote unquote sent for books from London. And so when I read that, I thought to myself, there was no Amazon.
No Amazon.
There was no, I mean, so can
months would go by.
That's the thing. So how did the postal system
Horseback.
work,
I mean, I
Josh?
guess it happened, but I really wasn't able to research this
Because
a lot.
there were so many letters.
It traveled overland, or it traveled, I guess, sometimes by boat, although the boats were, I mean, really, Iraq was, what is now Iraq, was a true backwater of the Ottoman Empire. Didn't really have much in the way of natural resources. It was, it was a low priority. There wasn't much trade. So a lot of these shipping companies saw absolutely no reason to go to the one port of Basra. And so you had like years go by, literally, when no boats would be stopping there. And so mail was difficult. I guess maybe in Tehran there was more of an organized network.
Yet people wrote letters.
People did write letters.
I don't know
back
how the letters
there were Ottoman mail carriers.
Were there?
Who absolutely, because a couple of times, and they had some protection, because a couple of times when Layard was out there and he had to move from point A to point B, he would always hook up with an Ottoman mail carrier, and I assume the mail carrier had Ottoman protection, but some military protection. So he would hitch a ride get an escort from this group. I would assume you always just hear about the Ottoman mail carrier. You don't hear about, but there had to have been a military component to that. But even that was not. There were stories that I uncovered of mail caravans being assaulted, and there's a story of Rawlinson sending all of his work over like the past year up to trying to get it up to London for a presentation at the Royal Asiatic Society. Marauding gang grabbed everything, all of his writings, all of his paper mache squeezes from inscriptions on palace walls. And the article talks about these Bedouin tribesmen running around with the Babylonian characters worn as amulets, So odd-looking cuneiform objects peeled off the walls that they just, I guess, like cut out and wore them around their necks and thought they'd be these queer, odd-looking things, might offer us some sort of protection.
Sure.
So, yeah.
When I visited the archaeological site of Nineveh, there was gnats all over the place, just swarms of gnats. And you wrote about Layard having to confront
the gnats
in
they actually
Nimrod.
make an appearance in my book.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, that
unbelievable.
was just,
they were absolutely biblical.
Yeah, because he was camping out alongside the Tigris River, and summertime, it was these swarms of insects and scorpions, which he referred to as a reptile. I thought that was rather amusing, but maybe in his view, these giant scorpions look more like reptiles than insects, And it was tough. It was tough. The heat. Imagine being out there in 120 degree heat. He worked through the summer, This guy just was unstoppable.
And it's not like they were wearing
Rawlinson too.
And it's not like they were wearing, lightweight Lululemons.
I don't know what they wore out there, but I mean, they must have had lightweight cotton, but still it was tough. And Rawlins, there was basically a hole in the ground, a tunnel, a sardab, I think they called it in Arabic, where the staff would crawl into in the residency. They would just spend hours there, in the darkness, in these tunnels underneath the embassy, because it was the only place that would give them a little relief from the heat.
And I think you said they also poured water on
the water
roof.
wheel. Yeah, somebody had rigged up a water wheel that allowed like lukewarm Tigris River water in the summer to pour constantly onto the roof of this study that Rawlinson had built for himself at the end of the embassy garden, and that got the temperature down to like the mid-90s.
Right.
Yeah. No escape, man. No air conditioning.
Indeed. Also, ferreting these large pieces out was a real task.
That was an incredible task. I mean, and Layard really presents some of his greatest stories in taking there's just a great story of his workmen disassembling a giant lamassu, which were these Sumerian-inspired half-man, winged half-men, half-bulls, or half-men, half-lions that you see on display at the Metropolitan Museum, at the British Museum, at the Pergamon. and weighing like 40 tons. And it was these amazing feats of bringing the great lamassus down, laying them on a cart, and then dragging them by hundreds of workers, dragging them to the Tigris River, placing them on these rafts, and then shipping them down to Rawlinson
and making sure the rafts didn't,
making sure
they
that
they didn't sink
or weren't attacked.
Yeah. May 1855, you wrote, quote, "The greatest material loss in the history of archaeology." It was 3 miles north of Qumran, where the Tigris and Euphrates come together. I had the good fortune of visiting there because that's where they say the Garden of Eden was.
Exactly.
There were 4
I've been
rivers,
there too.
once the Tigris and the Euphrates. And if you can talk about that, because that was really just heartbreaking, I mean, when I read it, but really such a loss for the archaeological and the ancient civilization world.
Layard was pretty much gone from the scene. Rawlinson was on his way out. This was sort of late in the day. There had been this 10-year period of frenetic activity in Mesopotamia that was kind of in northern Mesopotamia that was kind of winding down. And as one of Rawlinson's last acts, he kind of oversaw the shipment of a vast number, in collaboration with the French, shipped a vast number of crates and lamassus and winged angels down the Tigris River in a big convoy of rafts and a sailing vessel, possibly had an engine at that time, 1855. Anyway, they were warned repeatedly. He didn't go on it. He just helped organize it. It was run by the French. And they were warned repeatedly by the Ottoman officials in Baghdad. This is really an unstable time. The Bedouins are rising up along the Tigris. They've seized control of much of the Tigris. We strongly advise you not to ship these down. They rashly went ahead anyway, and paying off lots of extortion along the way to get safe passage by these various Bedouin gangs. And then finally they got to Qumran. And that's where they were just attacked by a swarm of these guys who ran over the vessels and sunk them and sunk the rafts and grabbed what they could. They were not interested in the relics. They were interested in the wood from the rafts, because they didn't have wood down in Babylon. So this was a hugely valuable. They didn't care about the lamassus. Those sank to the bottom of the river. Yeah.
Is there ever any talk of bringing that up from the bottom of the river?
They tried in 1972. There was a Japanese-led expedition to Qumran to look for. It went on a couple of months to search for the remnants of. Couldn't find a thing.
Do you think they all dissolved?
Didn't find a thing. I don't know. Good question. Maybe the water was just too murky to see anything, but they came up absolutely empty-handed.
Wow. So that's sort of
giant lamassus. Well, over 200 years in the water. I mean, I don't know.
For me,
150 years.
That begs the question then, what else is out there? Because every time I visit an archaeological site and I just see a field, I think, wow, what treasures lie underneath.
It's true.
It's
amazing
that
those treasures lay there under the mound for, 2,500 years, and
they're still discovering them.
Yeah.
Really. I'm a bit of a museum geek.
Yeah.
So I love the chapter called The Museum,
thank you.
Which you talked all about the origins of the British Museum and also these beautiful pieces from, Assyria, Babylonia, making it to the British Museum, and we see them today. Can you talk a little bit about the origins? Because I didn't really know the backstory behind the British Museum.
Kind of a disturbing origins of this museum. It was you forgive me for forgetting, Hans, I've forgotten his last name, but the founder of the museum in the 17th, he was a figure from the late 17th century who got his start as a collector. He was a physician who was sent out to Jamaica to be the personal physician for the governor, the British governor of Jamaica, which at the time was one of the great, most horrific slave colonies of the British Empire. And the future founder of the British Museum was totally caught up in slave culture. I mean, he began collecting whips that were used to, essentially torture slaves to death, skulls of slaves who'd been executed, homemade instruments, a slave Jamaican 17th century banjo. But really particularly focused on slave culture, and also quite sympathetic to the white slavers, and they wrote these lurid accounts of the punishments meted out to slaves that were just truly gut-wrenching to read. But he apparently approved of this. Anyway, this guy went on to great wealth. He married into a slave-owning family. And took that money and took his collection. It wasn't just slave stuff. He began expanding to collecting plants and all sorts of curiosities, as they called it back then. And then after spending millions on his collection, he willed it all for the price of £20,000, which I believe was about $3 million, worth about $3 million or $6 million today, to the British government. So the House of Commons approved it. They took over the whole collection, and in the 1730s, I believe, they created maybe a little later, 1750s, they created the British Museum, or the Museum of Britain, as it was then called. And it was really one of the earliest museums for the benefit of mankind. There was a great debate about who should be allowed to visit it, whether it should be open to the general public or just to the elite. So these kinds of questions really were part of the formative years of the museum. And then it became, of course, the repository for all of these astonishing relics that its teams of archaeologists were essentially looting from all around the world, but particularly from the Ottoman Empire.
And then that, of course, begs the question of the appropriation of cultural patrimony from around the world,
Yes.
whether it's the Benin bronzes, for example,
Yes.
or that came out of present-day Iraq and the Elgin marbles and so on.
Well, the Brits actually have apparently the greatest collection of the Benin bronzes, which I even surpassing. Well, I mean, the Germans have a big collection, and they've been caught up in that question as well about giving back their collections. But so far, the British have resisted giving back the Benin bronzes. They've resisted pretty much giving everything back. They're under constant pressure, constant fire, because people of Egypt wants the Rosetta Stone back,
and they do have the facilities
they
now
do
to protect them.
Iraq wants they haven't really made a serious effort to get Layard stuff back, but they want it back. This, despite having suffered an invasion by the Islamic State in 2014, in which the Mosul Museum was overrun, looted, and largely destroyed, and Nineveh and Nimrud were overrun and largely destroyed. So this, of course, gives a certain amount of validity or support to the argument by British Museum. I'm not sure if they've made that argument as that overtly, but basically the argument made over the years was that a museum like this is just simply better equipped to protect these objects, and also because of transportation networks, because of its place in the world, is just a better repository. More people will see these things from all over the world, and there are, if this stuff went back to Mosul, how many people are going to go visit Mosul, Iraq?
You and
see
Josh, Stephen.
It doesn't get too many visitors anymore, if it ever did.
They were built when I was there in 2022, the end of 2022. They were rebuilding that museum.
Yeah.
I think
Mosul was almost
helping them out
completely destroyed. It
Yeah.
was a subject of one of the most horrific wars of recent memory, and so it's going to be a long time before tourists begin returning in significant numbers. Whereas the British Museum, it's in a stable part of the world. It gets tens of millions of people passing through, and
There is the argument to be made for that.
There is.
There really is indeed. Josh, the book is so meticulously researched, and I love some of the tangents even that you went off on in the book. Like, I didn't know that Saladin, for example, was born in Tikrit, the same place that Saddam Hussein was from.
Yeah.
Actually, the hometown. So that was like a nice little factoid that I learned. But how did you really approach writing this book? Because, again, it is so meticulously researched.
I pretty much, I parked myself at the British Library for many months, parked myself in this beautiful room, the rare book room. And at that time, I don't know how many people are aware that the British Library underwent a really vicious cyber attack about a year and a half, possibly even 2 years ago, which a ransom attack, but the British Library refused to pay it, and it basically destroyed their entire system. They've had to rebuild it from scratch, so nothing is available. Gradually, things are going back online, but I was just kind of got in there under the wire, did my research before the attack, and was able. They had a magnificent system where you could get a hold of, manuscripts and diaries and letters and original newspapers, original magazines, the Illustrated London News from 1852. Type it in, call it up. Within 45 minutes, it was at your desk. So it was just an amazing, really efficiently run resource with these vast stacks down underneath the museum. And I probably did 90% of my research there. Also the Royal Geographic Society, the Royal Asiatic Society still exists in a much humbler form. It's like a couple of rooms in a not particularly nice corner of London. Just off, Euston Square. It's just not all that pleasant. It's not terrible, but it's an undistinguished little corner. But there's the Royal. I was expecting when I went looking for the Royal Asiatic Society, I had this idea of this, Victorian villa somewhere, but it didn't turn out to be that way. But they have a great collection of Henry Rawlinson's writings. Everything's there, and so everything was in London pretty much.
One of the things that I loved about the book and reading the book was that you referenced so many diaries and so many books that some of these archaeologists and scholars wrote themselves that I really want to start digging into those books.
Yeah, I think
that's part of the fun of reading a book like yours.
The problem with Henry Rawlinson was that he had like the world's most, illegible scrawl. And it just, it was just so time-consuming and tedious to make sense of a lot of his writings. Fortunately, there is an archivist at the Royal Asiatic Society. Guy must be in his about 88, 89 years old at this point, but he devoted several years, God bless him, to going through Rawlinson's letters and doing synopses with little, important quotes for, it was like just this voluminous file of material. So a lot of my work on Rawlinson, I was able to avail myself of that shortcut. I credited him in the book, I think, in the acknowledgments as well. It was a real boon because, the feud with Hinks, some of that stuff was really nicely laid out and legible.
Yeah, there was a Danish explorer, Carsten Niebuhr.
Yeah.
And I believe
Niebuhr,
is that how you pronounce it?
I think so.
And he wrote, and he has his diaries, and I really want to delve into them.
Yeah, he wrote in German.
Oh, okay, then that's going to be tough for me unless there's an English translation.
Because I live in Berlin, I speak enough German to make and read enough German to have made sense of it. There was that. His I don't know if it's been translated, to tell you the truth. Okay. There have been some. I might be wrong, but I didn't. But also, his son wrote a really decent biography of his father. In the 1830s. And then there have been a couple of excellent books I believe one by a Danish biographer who wrote about
if I can get them in English, because he was before the cast of characters that we spoke about.
He was the first, he really got the ball rolling.
He really did. And so he's the one that I really want to start focusing on. By the way, when I was in Persepolis, one of the things that struck me...
Amazing you've been there. I've never made it.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Okay, well, one day.
One day.
But when I remember walking in and seeing quote-unquote graffiti from the 1800s, and graffiti isn't, Vinnie loves Susie.
Yeah.
It's people etched their names into the stone and the year.
Yeah.
And their handwriting is so incredibly beautiful and flowery. And I took probably as many pictures of that as I did of the ruins of Persepolis. But that was one of my enduring images, actually, of Persepolis. Now, in keeping with, as we begin to wind down our conversation, in keeping with the theme of the One-Way Ticket Show, if I were to give you a one-way ticket or maybe a round-trip ticket, to the 1850s to meet this cast of characters that we spoke about at the top of our conversation, what would you want to tell them about the state of archaeology today, about their field, anything that would, jump out at you that you think would jump out at them, Josh?
Well, I would say that in our current era, we seem a lot more, it seems like we've turned you still get, I would point out that there are these crowds still showing up, you'd be happy to know, to the British Museum and admiring the collection and the work that you guys did. That's still very, very much alive and vital, and a great appreciation for what you guys have turned up, and our knowledge of Assyria and these lost civilizations is thanks to you dudes. But on the other hand, we really do seem to be focused, unlike your generation. We're looking a lot towards the future. I mean, instead of we're looking at AI, and we're looking. I mean, you Victorians also look to the future, but you had an appreciation and an awareness and a deep connection to the past that maybe our current society has lost quite a bit of.
You said in 1851-52 there was Assyrian fever in London.
Totally, yeah. I mean, okay, I may not be totally fair, because I do remember, the king.
The King Tut exhibit. What was that, in the late 70s?
Yeah,
wasn't it?
Right. And the incredible outpouring of interest in that. But it's hard to imagine. Well, first of all, it's hard to imagine uncovering a lost civilization that's still gone. I mean, but if you can imagine a lost civilization that remains lost. But in those days, everything was fluid.
Well, and
a lot hadn't been turned up.
Right.
Troy hadn't been excavated yet. I'm not sure about Angkor Wat. I don't think that around this time. I don't really remember.
I think it was more the late 1800s.
Maybe the late 1800s. Babylon didn't really get dug up until around the turn of the 20th century.
And don't forget, people are traveling now.
Yeah.
So they have the ability to see that. And with the internet, they see the images. So what really, really excites people today, and I agree, it's probably more focused on the future than the past, sadly. But the past has so much, indeed, to teach us. What's next then for Josh? No pressure, by the way.
I've been chilling out all winter, swimming a lot every day, getting myself into shape after holding up writing the book. And I'm really, now that the book is out, on my tour in the States, talking a bit about it. When I return home, I think that's the moment that I really begin to start thinking about another book. I really have come to love archival books. I've done a lot of different stuff. I've been on the road. A lot of the writing I've done has been archival. A lot of it's been on the road, having adventures. This one was really strictly archival. But I absolutely see I took a lot of joy in doing this book. I mean, even holed up in a library for months, and understanding the period and the work, the investigations, and trying to bring it all to life is a great challenge. So maybe I'll try to find another archival subject.
Yeah, because a final question, because I was going to ask you, is there a topic that you're particularly excited about?
Not really, but somebody said, there was a piece about this book in Crime Reads today. That said that compared it to my book, The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, and said,
which I loved.
It alights at the intersection of adventure and cultural history. And that's a pretty fair assessment, I think.
It really is.
So if I could find another one that alights at the intersection of those two subjects, that would be fine with me.
Send your recos
Not
to
that
Josh.
Easy. If you have it, yeah, please.
Right. All right. Well, listen, we're going to leave it right there. Again, the book, The Mesopotamian Riddle, an archaeologist, a soldier, a clergyman, and the race to decipher the world's oldest writing. It's published by Simon & Schuster. And once again, I hope you pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. Josh hopes so as well. But really, it is such a fantastic read. And we want to thank you, Josh, so much for joining us here on the One Way Ticket Show. And I hope it's not another 9 years before you come back on the show. But we should share with our listeners and our viewers, I did have the good fortune of having dinner with you in Kolkata.
Amazing. I'm
last
still waiting
year.
for that story to appear in Smithsonian. Supposedly it will be out in the fall.
All right. Well, let me know.
Yeah.
That was a
great trip.
What a fascinating city, isn't it?
Yeah, loved it.
Could do a whole episode just on that. Well, listen, it is always a treat to chat with you. So once again, thanks so much for joining us here on the One Way Ticket Show. And for you, our dear viewers and listeners, we'll have info about Josh on the homepage of our website, theonewayticketshow.com. Once again, theonewayticketshow.com. We'll also have a link to the book and to his other books as well. And once again, a reminder to follow the show and me on all social media. Just search for The One Way Ticket Show and search for me. Stephen Shalowitz is my name. And if you'd like to shoot me an email, Stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. Once again, Stephen@theonewayticketshow.com is my email. Do share your one-way ticket destination of choice. Let's even arrange a call and chat, because I'm always up for a great conversation, especially when it's about a book, history, archaeology, or probably anything else. In the meantime, it's a wrap for the One Way Ticket Show. For Josh Hammer and the entire crew, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and we'll see you next time.